So a little bit of a clarification in setting the stage of what I mean by fiscal policy is we're going to look at how these activities impact the macroeconomy. We're going to study it at the federal level. These kinds of things do exist at the state and local levels as well, but they're different. This treatment here is really going to focus on the federal. In the interest of time, really, I can't tell you that local fiscal policies tend to be focused on land use and things related to land use. Not all of them, but a lot of it is land use related. Okay, starting with the revenue side, one of the big areas on the revenue side with respect to federal government policy is taxes. I've listed three particular types of taxes there: sales tax, capital income and/or capital gains taxes, and the income tax. The income tax is the one that we're all familiar with, and it's coming up, tax day, April 15, right? That's those taxes there, the income tax. I have an asterisk there after taxes and a note at the bottom. For many countries, including the United States, these three taxes are something like 90% of federal tax revenues. So you might think of other taxes. They're either small at the federal level or maybe they're not even federal, like gasoline taxes. A lot of that is state, typically. It's really a state or mostly a state revenue source, not so much a federal revenue source. And so we're focusing on federal, and these are the big dogs. The sales tax, the capital tax, or capital gains, or capital income tax, and the income tax. Then we'll talk about borrowing, and we'll talk about something called the inflation tax. All right, starting with the revenue side. What are the economic impacts of different types of revenue side policies? We're going to do the tax policies first. So I have the sales tax there, the capital income, capital gains type taxes second, and the income tax third. So, and then it says impact on, and then there's a column for GDPE, or think of it intuitively as short-run GDP. And then the last column is GDPP, or think of that intuitively as potential or long-run GDP. So the short-run impacts of raising any one of these three types of taxes is that GDP would go down, right? So if on Monday I went to Target and the sales tax rate was 10%, I would spend a certain amount of money. If the next day, on Tuesday, I went into Target and the sales tax rate was 15%, 5% higher than the previous day, that's going to reduce my expenditures at Target, right? Taxes of this kind are disincentives to economic activity. The greater the tax, the lower the volume of economic activity. This is true for all of these types of taxes. It's true for income taxes. So if income taxes rise, that's a disincentive for me to work, and so I'll work less, everything else being the same. Capital income and capital gains taxes. If those are higher, that's a disincentive for both savings and investment, depending on who it is we're talking about. There's an immediate reaction to a higher tax rate on those types of activities, pulling short-run GDP down pretty much immediately. Okay, let's look at the long-run impact. On the long-run side, the sales tax doesn't have a big effect on potential GDP because it doesn't enter into that construct that we talked about, where we talked about what are the inputs that are needed to produce all the goods and services, right? So when we talked about potential GDP, we talked about the inputs that we need are capital, labor, public capital, that kind of thing. The sales tax doesn't really enter here, at least not directly. So I'm going to say, to keep this simple, no effect, NE, no effect on long-term GDP of sales tax. I'm saying for capital income tax and labor income tax, the bottom one, I put income tax, it's really labor income that we're talking about here, not capital income, right? Those are down. And the reason I say that is because both of those do show up as key inputs to the process of producing all the goods and services that we desire, right? So the bottom one, the income tax, the bottom one in the top panel, I should say, the income tax, that's a tax on labor income. So I work, all of you guys watching this video probably work at least part-time. We file our taxes every April 15. This is the tax we're talking about. And our work, the labor services that we provide, whoever we provide it to, is a key important part of the productive capacity. And so if we're disincentivized to work with a tax rate going up, then that's going to lead to lower productive capacity for the economy in the future because there will be fewer people working. Similar argument for capital income and capital gains taxes, because what that does is it pulls down capital stock. And capital stock is also a very important component to input to the productive capacity of the economy. And so that's an argument for potential GDP to go down if taxes on that type of activity rise. Okay, going to the second panel. So I wrote this a little bit differently, GDP now, GDP future. Let's talk about borrowing first. Borrowing doesn't really have an initial effect, but in the future, and I'll talk more about this later, government borrowings, government debt is generally retired in the medium and long run through tax rates going up, but in the future is typically how it's done. So the government does some borrowing, say in 2000, the debt gets rolled over, they're doing their interest payments, say for some number of years. It can vary, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10, maybe it's longer. But at some point, they'll raise taxes to then have the funds needed to just retire a big chunk of their debt, right? They don't generally retire all of it, but particularly in the United States in the past 100 years, or a little bit less, I guess. But they'll retire some of it. And how do they do that? They do that by generally by raising taxes. Well, because they're raising taxes in the future, so for my GDP future, I'm going to have taxes going up. The taxes they're going to use are these three taxes in the upper panel. And we've shown that they generally have a negative effect at the time that they're raised, at some future point in time that they're raised. So GDP would go down at that future point in time when the taxes are raised to retire some of the debt. Okay, that's borrowing. Then we have the inflation tax. This is kind of a fun one. This is one of those weird things where, economists have lots of formulas, and so we have our nice formulas and we do some derivations with it and we look at it, and you get these variables and these terms in this nice big formula, and you're looking at it and you're saying to yourself, okay, I see that there, but what's the story? So the story is a little bit of a tricky one, perhaps, so bear with me. What's going on with the inflation tax is it's the fact that inflation is generally positive, which erodes the value of currency. It turns out that erosion of the value of currency is a cost to the private sector, and it's a benefit, or it's a revenue source to the government. Okay, well, why is this? Here's the best example I can think of a story to help you see what's going on there. Suppose I decide to buy a treasury bond from the United States government. Okay, and let's think primary market only. Ignore secondary bond markets right now for this conversation, just for the moment. Okay, I give my $1,000 to the United States government and they give me a bond. 10 years later, there's some interest payments. Ignore the interest payments. This discussion is unrelated to those things. Talking about the par, right? I give them $1,000. 10 years later, they're going to give me $1,000 back. During those 10 years, there's inflation taking place. At the beginning of that 10-year period, that $1,000 is worth more, isn't it? We all know this. And the government gets it then. They give me back $1,000 later, 10 years later, after it's worth less. It turns out this is a revenue source to the government. They get to use the $1,000 and spend it and invest and do whatever when it's worth more. Kind of subtle, kind of a hidden thing, but it's there. Now, given that in the past 8 years or something, inflation rates in the United States and in many economies have been running at quite low levels, that means that form of revenue to the government has been at small levels, right? So that type of revenue to the government becomes large and significant when the inflation rate becomes large and significant and stays high for some period of time, like 5-10 years. Then it becomes relatively more noticeable. So it's a subtle concept, and in these days, it's a relatively small phenomena in magnitude.